Thank you and good morning, and really thanks for inviting me and for your hospitality, and particularly thank you to Yvette for your graciousness in dealing with me and organising this visit. Just to say that Australia has always occupied a very vivid place in my Labour imagination as a place where my countrymen and women who were enclosed, dispossessed and then criminalised for encroaching on what was once the commons built a better life. When I visited 2 years ago for the first time, I was beguiled by the familiarity and difference of Sydney. And when I returned to London, people asked me to put my finger on it. And in the end, the best I could say was that it was like visiting my cousins who moved out of London to the county of Essex and were somehow taller, happier and less anxious than I was. They were more at ease with themselves, more confident and better looking. And I felt guilty and confused for being envious and ended up feeling sorry for myself and realised that I was actually living out the internal real-life experience of being a whinging pom. It actually happened to me. So I concluded that the reason that we whinge all the time in your company is that we feel more than slightly jealous of you, of your sea, your space, your weather and your sporting excellence. We're jealous of your barbecues and above all your capacity for friendship. And I thank you for your generosity. It's wonderful to be back and I'm really not looking forward to going home. And that's because it's not only that I have 4 children, and it is really great to be separated from them for a while. When I told my daughter Anna, who is 14, that I had been invited, she looked at me with that amazed bewilderment and said, "Why are they inviting you? Why aren't they inviting me?" I'm a much more interesting person and I could meet 5 sauce. So this feeling of perplexed disappointment is perhaps the best way to sum up the mood of my house at the moment, and I really did enjoy the flight over. But it's not just that that makes me reluctant to go home. I'll be going back to a nasty election campaign in which we in Labour have failed to renew trust, failed to articulate a vision that resonates with the country, failed to articulate where we had failed as a government and what we had learned, and above all failed to heal the rupture with the working class. It feels like we have lost England while Britain crumbles, and there is a sense of being stranded. We have not moved ahead in the polls, and the general atmosphere is one where we would relish a coalition with progressive partners, an interesting phrase in itself, and we seem to have given up on building the coalition necessary for a popular majority Labour government. So the result of all of that is a sense of general disenchantment that this can't continue, and that change is not coming through a progressive politics that is overwhelmingly middle class and public sector, a politics that is not of the people, by the people and for the people, but at the people, to the people and on the people. The result that we confront is a right-wing and populist insurgency that we demonise rather than divide. So the Labour Party seems unable to generate a generous language and vision of the common good that reconciles estranged interests, capital and labour, immigrants and locals, religious and secular, and cannot either challenge capitalism or accept it, so we settle for taxing it. This ends up with a strange outcome that we are hostile to British business who actually vote, while we are also completely signed up to a dramatic extension of free trade in services as well as people, money and things within the European Union through the FTTP treaty, among other things. So we remain statist, administrative and rights-based in the minds of the people, constantly complaining of unfairness but unable to articulate a constructive alternative. In short, we have become the whinging poms of Britain. And the good news for you is that the English people don't like it either. So the private sector working class are moving to UKIP, and the public sector are moving more towards Greece than Germany in their desire for greater state spending irrespective of deficit, debt and the absence of value in the economy. So I note with some alarm that the perplexed disappointment of my home is spreading to the rest of the country, and it is turning ugly. A mood of blame and self-righteousness has entered the political conversation, and whether the demons are immigrants or the rich, scroungers or bankers, Europe or UKIP, it is all characterised by a reluctance to admit the fault within ourselves. and to actively find common ground and to deepen democracy. I was sent an email this morning from the party with the latest polling, and the Conservatives have moved into a 2% lead, despite being really useless and genuinely unpopular, and that makes me angry. In Scotland, the Nationalists have moved ahead by 21%, and that just makes me sad. So I think we are at the crossroads. Labour, Social Democratic and Socialist parties are losing all over the European Union and the Commonwealth. So it's my pleasure, as well as my honour, and an undeserved one, to be the speaker here this morning at this inaugural John Cain Foundation lecture. The more I read about John Cain, what you did, the more I like you. This was intensified after our tea yesterday, with your decency and your modesty combined with a sublime political intelligence that was elevating for me. And I'm still very interested in how you went about building your coalition before you got into power and how you held it together, because there's a great deal that I could learn from that. The courage that you showed in establishing some accountability for prisoners through an independent Solicitor General was courageous in all the right ways. The common good approach to welfare reform that you pioneered by engaging the users and providers of services rather than exclusively relying on managerial reforms remains the way ahead. John Cain reminds us that welfare is the way that we support and care for each other, and that makes demands on all of us, on users, workers and funders. Welfare is an active system of accountability and responsibility, not a passive system of administration and delivery. One of the most important areas of Blue Labour energy is vocation and vocational education, and the retrieval of the idea of a vocation of skilled work as having a status within the economy. John Cain was well ahead of us on this, and the work you've done here in Victoria is our friend as we fight our battles at home. The importance and complexity of the city is another distinctive feature of the Cain approach, with the insistence that the city is a place where people live as well as work, and I honour the determined expansion of homes in central Melbourne. John Cain also engaged with the task of how we honour the countryside and our natural environment and pass it on to the next generation as a treasure and wonder as well as a resource. There is a great deal of common ground that we need to work into a common good in the years ahead through renewing the idea of the Commonwealth. I think that all of this is part of the legacy of John Cain. So I am often criticised by academics, politicians and activists for working closely with faith communities, most particularly the church. And I always answer that at least they don't think that the free market created the world, that there is something precious and of value that existed prior to the price system. One of our great failures on the progressive left is the inability to connect to people around the idea that neither human beings nor nature are commodities. Neither were created in order to be freely traded on open markets, and the church has been a strong and natural ally to me in making this fundamental point about the destructive as well as the creative power of markets, as well as the limits of the state as the exclusive instrument of regulation. Building a common good between Greenpeace, the Catholic Church and the Firefighters Union is one very good way of conceptualising the approach I will be advocating this morning, and John Cain and this foundation are the perfect place to start. When I was asked about the John Cain Foundation, and I asked what it was about, I was sent a list of commitments which began with the courage of ideas. I thought that you must mean that, otherwise you really wouldn't have invited me, as a dark cloud of Twitter hate follows me wherever I go. Aristotle defined courage as the middle way between recklessness and cowardice. And if you take those two extreme terms, cowardice and recklessness, I think you have a very good definition of the English cricket team at the moment, swinging wildly between timidity and a brittle arrogance. There have been times when I have been reckless, when a lack of discipline or simply a new idea occurring to me in public or not quite grasping who I was talking to has tested the loyalty of my friends. But there have been other times when the thought of going into Parliament the next day and being met by the whips has meant that I have not said what was needed to be said, and I have also been guilty of cowardice. But this issue of courage is central to the work ahead of us, and that means hearing things we do not want to hear in ways that are difficult to accept by people we tend to look down on and tend not to like. So the big courage is to stay in the room, to negotiate, to build relationships with people who are not like us and do not like us. It is good to remember that for many people, the word progressive is the last thing they want to hear when they go to the doctor. At least it's progressive. At least my friends in the church are aware of their own sin, and I find it astonishing sometimes that my friends on the secular progressive left can humiliate people, be arrogant and dismissive, and not see that in themselves. Saul Alinsky, the founder of community organising and a great inspiration to me, defined a liberal as someone who walked out of the room before the argument began, and at a time when my party, Labour, is barely being heard by 70% of the population of Britain. It is time for courage and for a reckoning with the way that we have done things in the past. So you may regret having invited me, but I'm really honoured to be here, and it is very important to me. Australia is important because you are different. You are unique in your blend of democracy and liberty, tradition and innovation, in your place in the world. And it is very important that the Australian Labour Party do not become the whinging ponds of your own politics. You have the traditions and the liberty to change the dynamics of our present political malaise. As it stands, and I take a great interest in these things, social democracy has neither a concept of the social or of deepening democracy, and that is what has to change. When I was last here 2 years ago, I gave a talk to the Australian Society for Labour History, which I felt I had to come to the other side of the world to give, called 1945 and All That, in which I argued that far from being the crowning glory of our history, the 1945 Labour government was a turning point in the road to our own marginalisation. By putting all power in the hands of scientific managers through nationalisation and the welfare state, without any role for the workforce in corporate governance, for associations in housing or health, we undermine the functional relevance of the labour movement. For the great revisionist Edward Bernstein, the movement was everything and the ends were nothing. But for us, the ends were everything and the movement was nothing. And now we can see just how drastic the consequences of all that was. The 1945 paper followed me home, and perhaps it was the time difference, but the response was unusually thoughtful from areas of the progressive left and the party which had been hostile to previous incursions into this terrain. And in many ways, this morning's talk flows from that. So I think you've got the topic of this conference spot on in talking about markets, states and civil society, because the balance between these things are right out of kilter in England, and I'm looking forward to learning the ways in which things are different here. So the Labour tradition of a social democracy is built on precisely that. Democracy in the institutions of society and a defence of the idea of the social. Justice, understood as fairness, which is itself understood as a uniform legal procedure underwritten by equality, does not even begin to exhaust what Labour means by justice, which has been far more historical and linked to the violence and dispossession and inequality required to impose a commodity system of capitalism. This tradition, which is not the liberal or the progressive tradition, has far deeper roots in the idea of the Commonwealth, when that meant something domestically, in Congregationalism and the non-established and often besieged Christian communities of England, whether they be Catholic or Methodist, which had the practices of maintaining their self-organised institutions in a hostile environment. This tradition, I think, was far more robust in Australia than it was in England. And the Labour tradition holds that there are three kinds of power. So this is where I go very academic, so apologies for this. There are three kinds of power: money power, coercive power, and associative power. These in turn are based on contract in terms of the market, redistribution in terms of the state, and reciprocity in terms of society. So these are the concepts that organise my thinking on the state, markets and society, contract, redistribution and reciprocity. First, money power. So liberal economic and political theory tells us that money is not a power, and that the market is based on a myriad of uncoerced choices that determine price. But we know better. We know that capital has a tendency to centralise, every bit as strong as the administrative state. Money power allows you to employ people to pursue your ends, buy influence, and pursue an agenda amenable to your interests. We know that by pursuing deregulation in the factor markets of labour, land and food, there is a tremendous pressure to make everyone dependent on money through the enclosure of all forms of commons, and this turns our environment, otherwise known as nature, and labour, otherwise known as human beings, into commodities that are exhausted in their value by price. Politics, in contrast, requires a sense of place and a shared fate with others. Under these conditions of this relentless churn, we find ourselves all at sea. So it is important to assert, and I won't go into this too deeply this morning, partly because it is the morning, that the left lost the socialist calculation debate in the 1920s, and the price system is a better system for the communication of signals as to what people want than any other. I support free and open markets in real commodities. Without a price system to exert its pressure, there is no incentive to innovate, to improve, and to be more efficient. This is not an argument against markets, it is an argument against markets that are unconstrained in their remorseless and avaricious desire to turn everything into money. And when there is a domination of finance capital, which has an address and it's called the City of London, and it's got a branch office in Sydney, I note, then there is a merciless pressure to commodification, to turn things that were not produced for sale into freely traded commodities. Money never sleeps, and the demand for maximisation of returns makes one of the core aims of the John Cain Foundation, long-term strategic thinking, virtually impossible. So, well, what we need to remember is that finance capital, severed from institutional constraint, is by its nature promiscuous. It is constantly seeking new partners, higher returns on investment, more bang for its buck, trying to break free of old entanglements and relationships and hook up with new and younger partners that offer less resistance to its will and easier returns. It acts, as Aristotle said, that anyone and anything would act who was outside the constraints of relationships, i.e. like a beast or God. And as we found in the financial crash of 2008 in the case of the City of London, it was an equal mixture of both. Capital in this form tries to commodify, to turn something that was not produced for sale, such as human beings and nature, into a commodity for sale on the open market. It leads to the exhaustion of the person and their environment, of politics and society. So it is one of the central contentions of Blue Labour that the German post-war economy, with its regional banks that are not allowed to lend outside specified geographical boundaries, with the representation of the workforce on boards in setting strategy and to hold the managers accountable, and in works councils to raise practical issues of feasibility, that this is part of our inheritance. The Germans and the German economy weathered the storm with a far more resilient, robust and reliable economy than we did, and they seem to understand the difference between resilience and fantasy. We honour and learn from their vocational regulation, so that an apprenticeship has to be served as a condition of labour market entry, and in strengthening the institutions necessary to preserve, renew and teach skills, ethos and tradition. The very idea of a vocation is almost impossible to talk about within a state market system, based exclusively on the individual and the collective, with a big undifferentiated space in between, where there used to be a society. Leonard Cohen sings on his new album that he's standing on the corner where there used to be a street. And sometimes I feel when I speak in the Lords, I'm standing in a parliament where there used to be a society. I call it mentalism, where everything is about the head and there is no body, where it's all state and no body politic. So without constraints, capital has a tendency to three very ugly words that I would normally or usually never say before I've had lunch. But I have no choice, really. I can't find any alternatives. And capital has a tendency to centralisation, concentration, and commodification. And the resistance to the domination of capital is absolutely what the Labour tradition is about. We do not seek its abolition, but it is necessary to resist its domination. When Gordon Brown, who was, I don't know if you remember, he was British Prime Minister for a while, said in 2008 that it was the destiny of the Labour movement to save the global banking system, those of us who started Blue Labour knew it was time to say something and to do more. There is a distinction between fate and destiny, and that is given by democratic politics and we had lost it. So we assert in contrast the importance of labour as a source of value. And when I say in England that we won the war and lost the peace in relation to Germany, it is a bitter pill for people to swallow, but they know what I mean. The tragedy is that Germany has exported its goods, but not its good, to the rest of Europe. And the European Union is a fanatical force for the free movement of people and things. That is another reason to revisit the idea of the Commonwealth. We have the tradition and necessity to think of that relationship in a different way. A Commonwealth built around free and democratic trade unions, federal parliaments, self-governing universities and corporations like the BBC and ABC, self-governing cities and our churches, which protect a sense of place, virtue and solidarity through their institutional presence. And although it is not the direct concern of this morning's talk, it is another reason why I am delighted to be here. The earliest forms of the Labour imagination expressed their desire when they thought about what they wanted. They called it a socialist commonwealth. So we can think about an internationalism based on reciprocity, self-governing corporations, secular and religious, and about freedom of association within a genuine self-governing commonwealth, and I think it's worth just mentioning it so that we can talk about that in the future. But back to the talk. So that's money power, is this power, this centralised power to commodify and turn our environment and us into commodities, which has to be resisted by democratic association from within the Labour tradition. And then there is state power, which is a collective, coercive power to pass laws, punish, educate and tax. Given the enormous energy and power of markets, we can understand why the state came to displace democratic association as a means of resisting commodification and the domination of the rich. It was also necessary, given the growth and concentration of capital and the corresponding growth of widespread poverty and destitution, to establish the state as a central site of redistribution. Increasingly, the parochial system of charity and welfare could not cope with the scale of needs, or the generalised system of poverty, and the achievements of the Labour state are extraordinary in retrieving a human status that was not dependent upon money. The 8-hour day, the establishment of a national system of education and of a national health service, free at the point of delivery and paid for by redistribution through the state, stand to our credit. The Labour movement, however, built itself on the basis of democratic association funded by contribution. The benevolent societies in which people insured themselves against disaster, the burial societies through which people banded together and gave each other a dignity in death that was often denied to them in life through the pauper's grave, is another one. The building societies through which people supported each other to have a home in the world after enclosure and dispossession. The workers' education associations in which academics and workers taught each other are examples of mutual contribution as a model, but this was replaced and destroyed by a universal system based on need. It was for good reason that socialism, the belief in the social, the commitment to fellowship and friendship, to congregations and places, became statism, that the vision of social democracy became one of state administration based on the absolute priority of procedural justice. But it took the movement away from the people. It turned solidarity, the sympathetic care for others you don't know, and a shared responsibility for each other's fate, into a form of collectivism, in which taxation and voting in national elections became the primary link of workers to politics. The leadership of the Labour movement in Britain switched from the working class to the technocratic managerial class, who had far less understanding of the sentiments and interests of people who had not been to university. In the name of justice, the Labour movement sacrificed itself to the state, and the result was that when the state was captured by a very aggressive capitalist programme in the form of Thatcherism, the Labour movement was weakened in membership and relationships, having moved along with the idea that all that was necessary was to elect a Labour government which would subordinate the role and function of free and democratic trade unions as a partner in the economy and replace the movement itself with state provision. The result, which we are still living with, was a defeat, not only because of organisational weakness, but also because the Labour movement ceased to be connected to the lives of working people and was seen as a single interest, hostile to the common good and to innovation. We no longer develop leaders from the working class, but sent them to university instead. So Labour has also been extremely uncreative in its symbolic, theatrical and constitutional imagination in relation to politics and the state for many years. So the movement that gave us the federal monarchy, the socialist commonwealth and the city republics ceased to think of participation in terms of the economy or of political assembly. The uncritical apotheosis of the state in its purely welfare and administrative form meant that the values of contribution, of putting in and getting out, were undermined by need, collectivism and welfare. What was established as a site of solidarity became a bone of contention, polarising the poor between workers and welfare recipients. Above all, the exclusive focus on the state meant a remote and technocratic offer that offered very little space for people to shape their destiny together through a democratic politics. So once again, as I said with markets, the state is absolutely necessary for providing a floor through the living wage and a ceiling through an interest rate cap. It is absolutely necessary to tax and redistribute centrally and to enforce a legal order, but there needs to be some serious thought given to the way in which the failures of nationalisation and the defeat of Keynesian central economic management then led to an uncritical relationship with finance capital and an exclusively redistributionist approach to the state. James Purnell said it well when he argued here in Australia. He also told me that he felt he had to come to the other side of the world to say it. He said that New Labour was too hands-off with the market and too hands-on with the state. So Labour was born in resistance to the poor law state and built up its power through the building up of a movement that reconciled deep divisions within the working class, between Protestant and Catholic, between North and South, between the different nations of the kingdom. Labour is now the only party, Just, which represents all parts of the Union. It cannot be said, however, that it is of the people, by the people and for the people. This is because there are those in Labour who see local democracy as a potential violation of justice, understood as a uniform, universal procedure. It smells a rat in the redistribution of power to local places. It also smells a rat in the representation of the workforce on the boards of firms, because there is a suspicion that those who are most active, who tend to be better off and more educated, are the greatest beneficiaries. In that way, there is a sense that those who are good and participate and work are discriminated against in favour of those who do not give. I often hear it said, I talk to politicians all the time, particularly MPs, and I say, you know, why are you doing that? And they say, I am here to give voice to the voiceless. But it is time to remember that people can speak for themselves. As a party and as a movement, we are out of line with what the people still care about, which is their families, the place they live in, and their work, within a desire to be some part of something larger and something good. So if the market is based upon contract and the state upon redistribution, then the third kind of power, that of society, is based on relationships and reciprocity. It was this kind of power that formed the basis of socialism and of labour, in which dispossessed workers joined together in mutual associations through which they could bury each other, feed each other and house each other. These were known as mutual societies, building societies and cooperatives. People came together in mutual interest and built trade unions so they would not be isolated and prey to the domination by either the owners of capital or the administrators of the poor law state. So Labour politics was a politics of relationships. I was born in Waltham Street in East London, and the words are written in stone above the town hall: fellowship is life. The building of relational power through association transformed British and Australian politics and offers a clue to the remaining affections our Labour parties enjoy in the hearts of the people, but it is wearing thin. So I've tried to talk this morning about how somewhere along the line the left ceased having a distrust of the state and put an enormous faith in its administrative power, and through that undermined the relationships and institutions that were the roots of its civic power. You could say in theoretical terms that it led to the priority of the right over the good. and the left became technocratic, policy-based, and ceased to conceptualise a self-governing democratic polity, a commonwealth, but preferred a just, efficient state as the goal. And we stopped talking to each other, dancing, making friends, and started applying for capacity building grants from the state. We stopped looking to each other and started looking to the state. So there was a neglect of an old truth, that without democratic association, there would be a centralisation of both state and market power and the continued diminishment of relational power of civil society. This has deep structural causes and engages the most powerful interests, but it must nonetheless be challenged by a robust conception of civil society that challenges us to build a civic coalition that can include church, labour and environmental groups in resisting the relentless commodification of people and nature without resorting to an exclusive reliance on the state. The interests arranged against this are of the state and the market, who do not want accountability and resistance, but compliance and conformity. My experience is that when a campaign is led by people who have had direct experience of the indifference and cruelty of large institutions to family concerns and individual distress, then it succeeds in engaging the generosity and affections of a wide range of people and interests. But when it is led by policy people in the name of altruism, it tends to fail. That is because for those campaigns led by people with direct experience, there is also a sense of interests that are engaged. So Blue Labour is fond of paradox, something that sounds wrong but is right. And I'll just give you a few that we use to drive people mad. So things like tradition shapes modernity, the past is the future, or that leadership is necessary for democracy, that conflict is necessary for the common good, or that interests are necessary for solidarity. We also say things like only where there is a way is there a will, and there should be no responsibility without power. So it is the lack of space for civil society to exercise power that makes it weak and leads to a predominance of state and market funded NGOs that are not based upon dues paying members with interests and which hold the leadership accountable. One of the things we found was that people like meeting but not meetings. They like to meet with other people and do things. They like to hold powerful people accountable in public assemblies. So the tribunes of Rome is something that we could usefully think about in terms of renewing accountability. So I found that a very strong emphasis on leadership development from poor communities, from working class and immigrant communities, often through their faith institutions, was the best way to bring the sentiments and interests of people excluded from the progressive zone of policy development into the political arena of contestation and change. The living wage campaign that you mentioned, that I worked on for a decade with London citizens, was overwhelmingly led by Catholic cleaners, Muslim security guards and black church cooks who had followers, imagine that, and organised and led the negotiations with the head of Barclays Bank and the Mayor of London. And they won because they had followers and they were organised, who brought people with them into the room and challenged the existing relationship of subordination. Overwhelmingly, they were contracted out, so the big issue was to get some kind of relationship to get them back in. And that was impossible without tension, but it was above all impossible without having genuine leaders. So what did I do? I was really just hanging around helping with the script, with the strategy, and that is just where I should be, because I went to Cambridge University and I worked as an academic, and I earned a lot more than all of them for doing a lot less. So, accepting and strengthening the leadership of the poor was my big conceptual breakthrough. Things went well for me from then on, and it all ended up because England still has a sense of humour in being made a lord. You should have heard the laugh from my wife when I told her. That was that tinkled down the register. So now I'm organising the elites, and I realise that they don't view leadership that way, as having friends, bringing them with them into the room, having an argument. They view leadership in an administrative way, not a way of keeping the relationships and delegating the tasks. That was one of the things we always said. What is leadership? Leadership means you keep the relationships, but you tell other people to do the admin. What they do is they do the admin and they push out the relationships. And they lose themselves in technical details. They don't have one-to-one conversations with other leaders, and they're not building a coalition that could win politically. There is so much talk of principle and policy, and so little of politics and winning. And so I've just come to tell you the truth. I came across better leaders in the black church in New York than I do in Westminster. I met people there who revel, you know, who act. Machiavelli said, what is political leadership? He said it's the ability to act in time, to seize your moment, to grasp it, and to revel in the glory of it all. And there's very little action, and there's very little glory at the moment. So what I am saying is that the building of relationships is necessary for effective action. There's got to be that trust between people, that this requires leadership from within communities, with an interest in changes that will make their lives better, like a living wage, like an accountable hospital management, like schools that learn as well as teach. And this requires a big change in the way we think about civil society, which also includes the institutions of our body politic, our universities, churches, football clubs, mosques and unions. This building of relationships between institutions, as well as between people, generates the power to act through resisting the domination of the state and the market, of private and public sector managers, and enables a negotiation to take place in which society itself and civil society is a force. That is the plain truth. Both the market and the state are too strong because society is too weak. Only through building up relationships and power can that be changed, and that is not an administrative act, but a political one. That is the destiny rather than the fate of the labour movement. So relationships, power and action are the order of the day for civil society. This requires a reconciliation of estranged interests around the idea of a common good. The goal of the John Cain Foundation is a strong, sustainable economy for the 21st century, but this requires that it be negotiated with the interests of labour and the church, as well as businesses, schools and universities, through the idea of a vocation. I got into enormous trouble, and not for the first time, with the medical and legal establishments when I suggested not only that we should shut down half our universities and turn them into vocational colleges, and that was really self-interested, because I wanted to teach politics as a vocation, you know, rather than do comparative analysis. So I said, oh, let's do that. But, but I also suggested that they move the law schools and the medical schools into the vocational colleges, and the accountancy and dentistry into the vocational colleges. And you should have seen the outcry that followed. You know, the idea that their children should go to college with plumbers and carpenters was really not acceptable. But what I said then and what I say to you now, you know, nobody ever heard of a vocational foul. That medicine and law and dentistry and accountancy need to remember their vocation, their ethos, that they're not just professions concerned with self-interest. So if the financial crash of 2008 taught us anything, it was that accountability was too important to be left to accountants. So I've not succeeded in getting that commitment into the manifesto, I want you to know. So one of the key rules of organising is that the action is in the reaction. And that political leadership is about generating a response, conflict, tumult, and thinking ahead so that new allies and relationships can be formed. It's about rediscovering interest in civil society rather than exclusively relying on programmes with aims and objectives. Civil society should be understood as a terrain of power and negotiation, and through that our conception of politics should not be exclusively focused on the state, but on building coalitions and relationships that can put pressure on the state and the market. So if as a foundation you are exclusively concerned with policy development, you will not generate a reaction. You will not develop new relationships and coalitions, but you will be absorbed by business as usual. But if you have the courage of your ideas, you can make friends, get into trouble, and change the world. A strong and sustainable economy without a vocational system that is a rival in excellence to the university system just won't happen. Without building up regional banks that redistribute capital to local families and businesses so that they can work out their own solutions, you will not facilitate enterprise. Innovation can only be strengthened with a retrieval of tradition and good practice so that things can be combined in new and unique forms. through giving incentives to virtue rather than incentives to vice in the economy, you can generate real change. By recognising that transparency must be complemented by accountability, and this could be done through democratic public assemblies as they were once done by the tribunes in Rome, you will be innovating politics through bringing exiled traditions back to life. With John Produce in Labour, we have built all these things into the policy review, and they are making friends and generating energy. So there is wonderful work to be done over the next decade, and the framework you have laid out is rich in possibilities. I am thrilled as well as honoured to have been invited to give this talk, and whether after what you have heard this morning you wish me and Blue Labour to be part of that conversation is your decision. For myself, I am grateful for the opportunity to speak to you and to be back here again in your beautiful country. So thank you very much.